Good morning and welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist video series. I am Phil Long, Precision Agronomy Advisor with Latham High-Tech Seeds, and today I'm going to talk to you on a little bit of a gloomy day. I'm going to talk to you about fertilizer. Fertilizer woes or fertilizer prices, a very hot topic right now. We've seen essentially a double over last year in terms of, well, P and K as well as nitrogen fertilizers. They're all kind of going through the roof right now. So if you haven't priced them yet or haven't already got pre-priced them, you're probably looking at a little bit of a predicament trying to figure out the best scenario in terms of trying to lower those input prices in terms of preparing for 2022 crop. So I want to talk a little bit about that today, some of the things you can do, some of the things maybe you shouldn't do. But the best place to start off with first is talking about how important these are, and I want to focus primarily on phosphorus and potassium. Nitrogen is kind of a whole different animal, and we'll talk about that in a separate video, but focusing on P and K today. And phosphorus and potassium both play a huge role in soybeans and corn early season, getting those plants established, the early season root development, really getting that plant off to a good start. That early vigor really plays a large factor in yield at the end of the season. Those of you that use in-furrow and things understand the importance of phosphorus and what it does early season to really help that plant get off to a good start. So they also, on the potassium side, plays a big role in stalk strength late season, like we're looking at right now during harvest time, that lignin content and helping to develop that lignin and keeping that stalk strong all season long. Potassium also plays a big role in water uptake and use throughout the season, which we saw this year in the areas that had a pretty tough rain situation. Phosphorus, if you have issues with phosphorus, you'll typically see that purpling early on in the leaves, and then obviously there'll be some issues with ear development too. It plays a big role in seed development on the plant. So two really important nutrients when it comes to getting that crop off to a good start and growing well and healthy all season long. So the first thing we need to do before we get too far in depth, I want to just cover where you can cut back and where you shouldn't cut back. But in order to understand that, we need to have a recent soil test. So if you haven't taken a recent soil test, that's my number one piece of advice. We're looking at potentially double the cost, so from $60 an acre to maybe $120 an acre spending on those fertilizers, paying for a $10 an acre soil sample to get a really good understanding of where you're at and which areas of the field maybe you can cut back on, or which fields you could cut back on, is really going to pay dividends at the end of the day. So getting a soil test. And then the next thing we need to look at is those critical limits on the soil test, what I'll call them critical limits, gauging where things are at. So when it comes to phosphorus, I typically think around that 15 to 20 parts per million, and potassium is more like 150 to 200, depending on soil type and a few other things, CEC and so forth. But some general guidelines, being in that region is where you want to be. Once you understand that critical limit, then you can look at the crop removal. So how much is a crop removing? Corn and soybeans, I like to make the comparison of 200 bushel corn, 60 bushels soybeans. So those are roughly opposites in terms of P and K. So a 200 bushel corn crop is going to remove about 70 bushel of P and 50 bushels of K, and a 60 bushel soybean crop is going to remove about 70 pounds of potassium and 50 pounds of phosphorus. So they're kind of opposites when it comes to that, but that's an easy way to think about it, and then you can back down from there if you don't quite hit those yield limits. So once you understand that, then my suggestion would be I wouldn't worry too much about backing off in terms of fertilizer this fall, especially if you're at that level where you want to be sitting at above that critical level. If you're sitting there, then I would probably back down. You could go 75% or something on your removal rates, because obviously you're removing that crop every year. So if we have a really good crop next year, we're still going to be removing that same amount of P and K from the soil. So you need to replenish it. Otherwise, you're going to get to a point of no return, and it's going to get very expensive to get back in there. Just as a reference point, it typically takes, on phosphorus, it typically takes about 16 to 20 pounds of phosphorus fertilizer to increase your soil test by 1 part per million. So if you've ever looked at soil tests too closely and look at those, even 15 to 20 on phosphorus, just 1 part per million takes 16 to 20 pounds of phosphorus fertilizer. On the potassium side, it's going to be in the range of 8 to 10 pounds of potassium fertilizer to raise it 1 part per million. But we're talking, we want to be in the 150 to 200 pound or parts per million range. So just keep that in mind. It takes a lot to build it back up, so you don't want to get it down to a point where you can't, over a few years get it back up. The point with that is, if you're under that critical limit, you are directly impacting yield. So that's really where your decision should be, whether to cut back on fertilizer or not. If you're under that critical level, having an agronomist look at that soil test and tell you if you're under that critical level. If you are, you're going to be losing yield directly by not applying fertilizer. If you're over that, then you're not necessarily going to see a yield increase. You're just continually maintaining and keeping that soil test where you want it to be. So that's the removal part, where you can potentially cut back on that a little bit. And then my second piece of advice would be to fertilize on a year-by-year basis right now. So if you typically do 2 years, you fertilize ahead of corn and you fertilize for corn and soybeans, I would, you could cut back for a year or two, fertilize right ahead of that crop, just 1 year at a time, until the fertilizer prices maybe come back down, and then reevaluate with the soil test. So that would be the best way to do it. Cut back a little bit on the fields that you can, especially if you've got fields that were manured or something like that, that may have higher levels. Those would be ones you can obviously cut back on and not see a yield hit at all. And then you can add a little bit to those fields that could use some extra. This is not a great time to build, obviously, your soil tests, and given those numbers I told you, that should discourage you from building too much this year. So where not to cut back. So if there's a silver lining on all this, I'd say it's with ag lime. Ag lime, to my knowledge, from what I've seen, has not increased that much. If it has, you can let me know. But the great thing about this is, when it comes to ag lime impacting your pH range of your soil, pH really affects every nutrient out there and the availability of it in the soil and how your plant can take it up. If you're just putting on P and K fertilizer and never paying attention to pH, you're basically throwing your money away, because you want to make sure that pH is in a range. And when it comes to this, I usually reference phosphorus, because it has kind of a narrow band there where it likes to be. Once you get too high pH, it's going to be tied up with calcium. Once it gets down to the lower end, it's going to be tied up with things like aluminum and iron and some metals. So you really want to have it in that range where it wants to be, that somewhat neutral zone, so that things are more available to the plant. The plant has an easier time getting them up. You don't have to spend so much money on fertilizer, and it's offsetting. So just as a quick reference on that, typically when you apply 100 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer, you need about 500 pounds of lime to offset that. So that's a general rule, general guideline, something to keep in mind. It takes about 5 times the amount. And if you're getting good yields, that's one thing. But if you're not getting the good yields and you're still applying lots of nitrogen, you're really acidifying your soil even faster. So some things to keep in mind, but remember that critical limit and how important that is. If you don't understand it, take it to an agronomist, myself, or somebody that can look at the soil test and tell you where you're sitting at, whether you're in a range that you could potentially decrease how much fertilizer you're putting on for this year. Until you get to next year, you see the yields you're having, realize how much you removed, then you can adjust it, and hopefully fertilizer prices have somewhat come down from where they're at right now. So just some simple guidelines to kind of keep in mind this fall as we're going about looking at our phosphorus and potassium fertilizers. Hopefully this helps a little bit. As always, we welcome questions. Reach out to us on our social media platforms or give us a call directly. We'd be happy to hear from you. So look forward to seeing you next time.